I hope everyone's doing well. We're going to kind of start off our semester here. We're going to have a little introduction into kinesiology, and then we will be diving into some different topics. Specifically, here in the beginning, we're going to talk about a lot of different principles with human movement, whether that's through our discussion with some of the osteo and arteriokinematics that we'll get to in the second video, in opening and closed chain movements, or just general movements that everyone goes through, right? That are kind of joint specific and really laying down our foundation of understanding what human movement is so that we can evaluate it correctly, and also so that we can teach and coach and get people to move more efficiently, or to get people into a spot where we would like them to be, right? Whether that be sports specific, whether that be through strength training, whatever the case is. So when we first start diving into this, right, the first thing that we need to do is have some definitions of what we're talking about. And the first definition, right, is that kinesiology itself. And so kinesiology is the study of principles of anatomy, physiology, and mechanics related to human movement. And so this is kind of that all-encompassing idea. And that's why we're the school of kinesiology and nutrition, right? Is that we can talk about anatomy, we can talk about physiology, we can talk about biomechanics, we can talk about motor learning, right? And understanding human movement. So coaching is understanding human movement. If we want people to be able to do things on a field or on a court quickly, right, we have to understand those basic principles of human movement. When we start dealing with structural kinesiology, right, we're going to be starting to get into the study of muscles and bones and how they relate to the science of movement. And so this is understanding that every joint is going to have some specific aspects to it that are going to be a little different as we start comparing our joints. But there's also going to be a general thread that we'll see throughout this class, right? When we talk about planes of movement, when we talk about general joint motions, but every joint has kind of its own uniqueness. Right? And so we're going to dive a little bit more into the structural kinesiology in this class. But to do that, we need to lay down some basic understandings. And there's one of the first things that we need to understand is this idea of kinematics. And what kinematics is a branch of understanding mechanics, right? And biomechanics and just engineering in general. When we talk about kinematics, we're talking about describing motion without regard to what is producing that motion, and force is what produces that motion. So we can get into that a little bit later on. But for now, just kind of understanding that we're describing motion. And when we talk about the description of motion, we have two main ways that we can do this. We can do this either through translation, right, which is just ourselves moving, right, or we can have rotation. And translation is describing a linear motion, right, or that we're going to have all the points on a object, right, that are traveling at the same speed, the same velocity, in the same direction, where rotation is a circular path, right? And so when we talk about linear motion, we can have two forms of linear motion. We can have what we call rectilinear, and we can have curvilinear motion. So rectilinear motion is everything being locked in a position and moving along a straight line. So if we look at our skier here, right, her feet, her hands, everything is going to be going in a straight line or a straight path at the same speed and the same velocity. Where in our second picture, the picture here at the bottom with our skier, right, they're in the air. And so if we think about, if you throw a ball, or if we have any sort of flight, right, we're going to be going on a curved path that we're going to have some element of traveling horizontally, and we're going to have gravity pushing us down. So we're going to travel vertically. So it becomes this curved path that we're traveling on. Now, in this case, right, this person's in a fixed position, and all the points on their body are traveling at the same velocity or the same speed. That's what's making it linear, right, is that everything's going at the same speed in the same direction, whether that's in a perfectly straight line, right? Or if we're on one of these curved paths, kind of going through flight or going through the air. The opposite of that is angular motion, right? And so this is where we have a axis of rotation, and we're going to have something going around that. So if we think about our girl throwing a softball here, right? Her shoulder and her arm, right, is or the movement of her arm is going around her shoulder. So everything is going to go right in a circular path around that shoulder to throw that softball or to pitch that softball. Now, based on some physics, right, and some understanding of human motion, her hand is traveling at a different speed or a different velocity than her elbow, than her shoulder. So not everything is now going at the same velocity. And so this is where it becomes angular. And so when we think about human movement, what we end up having is a combination of these two, right? In that to translate or for us to move on a straight line, like we're doing something like walking, right? For us to walk down the sidewalk, our joints are going to be moving in a rotational aspect, or we're going to have angular motions. But our center of mass or our center point of where all of our mass is evenly distributed, right, is going to move in a translation, right? Or it's going to move kind of in a nice straight path for the most part. Now, we can also see some translation of our head. So when we are walking, right, we're actually, our head is going up and down, and that can change about 5 centimeters, and 5 centimeters is roughly about 2 inches, right, that you're going to go kind of up and down as you walk. And that's because of these angular rotations that are happening down below or underneath us. And so if we want to think about another example of the way to describe some of these motions, we can end up with what we call, again, rectilinear, curvilinear, and angular motions. But think about our gymnast here. So now, if our gymnast is going and trying to get up to that high bar, right, and they're going to jump straight up, her feet, her hands, her hips, everything's traveling in a vertical line straight up to grab the bar. When she goes from the high bar down to a lower one in this event, right now, everything's going to be traveling along that curved path. But when she's swinging, right, around the bar, it becomes angular motion. And so the important part to understanding this is that we have different ways of describing the motion that is occurring. Right? And this is important to have for a basis to be able to identify motion, to identify weaknesses in a movement pattern, to become more efficient in our movement patterns, is we got to be able to delineate between some of these different forms of motion. And so when we put these together, right, what we end up having is what we call general motion. And when we think about throwing a football, whether it's me throwing a football, which would be an absolute duck of a throw, right, a nice tight spiral, but the ball is going to be going, have a horizontal component to it, right, and it's going to have kind of an arc to it. We can think about that when we throw the ball, right? So we're going to have some level of linear motion, curvilinear motion. But the ball itself is also rotating about an axis to spin and to have that spiral. So it has an angular component as well, which means that it's got both, right? It's got both an angular and a linear component to its movement. So we're going to call that general motion. So if we go back to the example of walking, right, this becomes general motion. We're having an angular motion, right, of the joints, right? Our joints are acting in an angular fashion, and our center of mass or our belly button is translating or having a linear motion. So we would end up having general motion. Now, to get back to this idea of kinematics, right, what we are talking about is, again, the description of the object, or in what we're talking about for the most part, for the purposes of this class, is the center of mass moving, right? And so we are moving through this translation, or we move through a rotation of limbs around a joint powered by muscles. And so when we talk about our center of mass is the point in which if we were to divide our body up equally, right, in our three planes of movement, that everything is evenly distributed. Okay. And so when we talk about this, there's two ways that we can talk about it. When we describe things to individuals, right, a lot of times we don't use the perfect terminology. So if we were to say an athlete is explosive, right, we can all kind of picture in our head of someone being fast, they can jump high, they can do things quickly. That's what explosive would be. Well, in reality, the definition of explosive is that we're going to have some sort of explosion. Well, nothing is blowing up, right, with that athlete. So the terminology isn't always necessarily perfect. So when we talk about center mass, right, if we're going to tell Granny where our center of mass is, it's typically we're going to point to our belly button, right? That's kind of our even distribution point. Well, in reality, we have a bunch of mass, or we have muscle and bone and everything that's back behind there. So it's not an even distribution point. So we end up with this intersection that is kind of deep to our belly button or inside our pelvis, right? Is where our center of mass typically sits. And so when we start talking about having this, point of reference, right? And this becomes really, really important as we get further into this class, is understanding this reference position and what we're talking about, right? Is that we want all of our movements to be based off of this initial point, right? Or this initial position. So our anatomical reference position, if you've never heard of this or never seen it before, deals with where's our starting point. And so our starting point is, what we're going to do is we would have someone standing facing forward, right, with their palms up, hands down to the side, and we would tell them to be looking at the horizon, right? And we'd want them to get their ears in line with their shoulders. That's our basic starting off point. And then we can have all these descriptions of different motions and where things are off of that basic starting point. So for people that maybe need a quick refresher on this, right, or you've never heard this before, this is a really good kind of picture to start thinking about these things. So things like superior, inferior. So superior would be moving up, inferior would be moving down. Proximal is going to be closer, right? Distal is going to be further away. If we start talking about medial and lateral, so medial is going towards the middle, lateral is going to the side or to the outside, right? So maybe brush up on those if you haven't heard them before. Kind of go through the text. They have some good description of those, but this is where we're starting off from, right? Is this anatomical reference position. So we can have our nice little diagrams here. Now we have a picture of a real person. We can start putting some of this together. Okay. And so to do that, where we need to go is really getting into the nuts and bolts of foundational knowledge for understanding human movement. And the first spot for that is anatomical planes and axes in our general joint motions. And so when we start thinking about how can we divide up our body, we can divide it up in three ways, and we move in three what we call planes, right? And so these anatomical planes are moving either forward and backwards or anterior posteriorly, right? It's moving side to side, which would be having our medial lateral motions, right? Or we can move in what we call a rotational, right? So if you were to turn your head around to look behind you, right? That's a rotation. You're not moving side to side. We're not moving forward and backwards. We're rotating or we're spinning, okay? And so to do that, we can divide our body up. And this is where, again, we can come back to our center of mass. So we have three planes of motion, the first being the sagittal plane, which is going to cut us into left and right portions, or medial and lateral portions. We have our frontal plane, right, which is going to cut us front to back, or anterior, posterior. And we have a transverse plane, which cuts us kind of in half, right, top and bottom, or superior, inferior. And with each one of those, we can move that to a specific joint, right? And then we can create these axes of rotation. So there's a supplemental video that goes into this a little bit more in depth if you need a refresher or you've never heard of this before, right? That kind of will walk through this a little bit more in depth for you. But just to understand that when we talk about these motions, what we're really doing is we're moving in a plane and we're going about one of these axes, or we're spinning around one of these axes. Right? So for every plane, we have a specific axis of rotation. So when we are moving in the frontal plane, right, which would be moving side to side, so to pick your arm up and go side to side, right, the axis of rotation, or where we would pin our arm so that they can spin and go side to side, right, would be going forward and backwards. So you can think of the axis of rotation like the hinge, right? So you have your door hinge, and then that's how you would spin. So if this is the closed door, right, and we want it to hinge, we'd put our hinge here, and then we would open it up, and this is how we would spin through there. In the sagittal plane, right, so we're going to cut ourselves left and right, or medial lateral portions. Now that hinge is got to go the opposite direction, right? So if we're not going to go side, or we're moving forward and backwards, so if we can think of like our head nodding forward and backwards, right? To do that, we would then have to put that hinge going side to side, or having a medial lateral. And then if we were to think about spinning our head, right, or shaking our head to say no, or whatever the case may be, right, that hinge would then need to run top to bottom to make that spin, right? Like kind of like a top. All right. So inside of each one of those planes and each one of those axes, we have joint actions. In every joint action, we're gonna typically talk about this relative to the movement that's happening at the joint. So if we're going to flex a joint, right? So if we have elbow flexion or elbow extension, right? So that we can talk about it specifically and what's going on there. So unless we, and unless we have that joint component to it, it's kind of useless. So to just say we have flexion, or to say we just have extension, or we just have abduction or adduction or internal rotation or external rotation, without that joint specificity, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And this is where we can get into our particulars in terms of some joints are going to have some motions, some joints are not. Right? And so that we can make sure everyone's on the same page. So generally, our joint motions are going to be caused by muscles with that same name. So if you flex your knee, this is typically accomplished by the knee flexors. Right? And we're going to go joint by joint as we work through the semester, and you're going to see how that works with this muscle giving us this action. At this point, what we really need to make sure that we understand is that we have a plane of movement, we have an axis of rotation, and then every one of those planes has associated movements behind it. So when we're talking about these general joint motions, the first set that we're going to go through, and the ones that we see the most, are flexion and extension. So this is talking about if a joint angle is getting bigger or if it's getting smaller, right? And so extension is when that angle gets larger, right? Flexion is when that angle gets smaller. So we're typically bringing something to us. Another way that we can think about this, right, is if a person, or we're coming in or out of the fetal position, right? So if we think about getting into that fetal position, all these joint angles. So if we're looking at this arm here, right? This angle here is smaller than the one on the left. So the one on the right has a smaller angle than the one on the left. So if you're coming into that fetal position, right, we're going to be having flexion. If we're coming out of the fetal position, we'd be having extension. Now, the one joint where this becomes a little tricky and where sometimes we see some confusion, right, is with the shoulder. So if we were to think about everyday verbiage and what people do and talking about actions at the shoulder, we would think about reaching over your head, right, as extending because we're getting longer, right? This is like an extension cord, you're getting longer. But in reality, right, we have to go back to that neutral anatomical position. So if we go back to our anatomical position, this is where we're starting from. Okay? If the arm here starts moving upward, right? So if I'm going to raise my arm up, I'm actually coming closer to the fetal position, which means that from our neutral spot and coming up, right, is flexion. Now, from our neutral position, right, or our starting position, reference position, and going backwards, this is getting longer. Right? So we're into extension. So this again is an important aspect in terms of when we evaluate movement, when we talk about movement versus everyday verbiage that we have. We wouldn't tell someone if we want them to reach up and try to get a rebound in basketball, right? That they need to flex their arm as they're going, right? We're going to tell them, hey, get as extended as you possibly can. Because when we think of extension in other terminology that is used, right, it's about getting longer, right? That you would have an extension cord, or if I gave you an extension for an assignment, you got more time. Right? In the terms of human movement, we're talking about joint position based on where we're starting in that reference position. So it's not about getting longer, right? It's about the angle itself. Did it get bigger or did it get smaller? And again, that in and out of the fetal position. So our next set of joint motions, and these are associated with the frontal plane, right? So the frontal plane cutting us front to back or anterior, posterior, are going to be abduction or abduction and adduction or adduction. And so these can get confused quite often, especially when we're first learning these. But abduction, right, is when we are going away from the center. Right? So if we're looking at our hand here, right, and it's nice and closed. If we're moving our fingers away from that middle finger, right, it's abduction. They're getting bigger. If we pull everything in, it's adduction, where you're adding to. Right, is a way to think about that. So these actions are occurring in the frontal plane, right, around that anterior posterior axis. So even when we just pick up our arm, right, to the side, this would be ab and adduction. So we have some joints, right, like the elbow, where we can't move side to side. So we don't move in the frontal plane at the elbow. Okay. We have some joints where we do. So we think about our hand spreading, or if we're going to wave back and forth, right? Or if we're picking up our shoulder, okay? Those would be examples of moving in the frontal plane in ab and adduction. And then our last set of general joint motions goes into internal and external rotation. And this is in the transverse plane. So this is taking the anterior surface, so that front surface. So again, back from our neutral position. And is it coming towards your midline or towards your zipper, or is it going away from your zipper? It's going away from the zipper, it's external. And if it's coming towards the zipper or towards that midline, it is internal rotation. So out of this first chunk of material, right? I know it's kind of going a little quickly. The biggest thing is understanding our planes, our axes, and our general joint motions. This is critical to our understanding as we move through all these joints that we'll get to here in a little bit, but general joint motions, right? So we have a plane, we have an axis, and then we have the general joint motion. So if we were to work through this, right, we would have our sagittal plane, which means that we are moving forward and backwards, right? So sagittal plane cut into left and right portions, medial lateral portions, with a axis of rotation that would be running medial laterally, because that's the way that we're being cut, right? And then we would have our flexion and extension. Again, there's a supplemental video that's going to be posted to go along with that kind of dives into that a little bit more. So please be on the lookout for that. The next part, right, is this idea of degrees of freedom. And what degrees of freedom entail is talking about how many motions can a joint move through independently. Right? So if we were to talk about degrees of freedom, it's how many planes do we move in? Because if we were to think about our wrist, for example, right? So if we have our wrist, we can go flexion and extension. So we can go forward and backwards, right? And then we can go side to side. That's what the wrist itself can do. The spinning is not actually at the wrist, right? These bones, right, are all staying in line. It's at the elbow, right, is where that action is actually occurring. So at the wrist, we have flexion and extension, so we can move forward and backwards, right, and we can move side to side. So we would have 2 angular degrees of freedom. We get sagittal plane, flexion, extension, the joint angle getting bigger and smaller, and then we would have frontal plane movements, right, going side to side. So we can go to or away from our zipper, right, or that midline when we talk about the wrist. If we went to the elbow, right, and we start thinking about the elbow, the only thing we can do with our elbow is just make that joint get bigger and smaller. So we would have 1 angular degree of freedom, but we would have 2 actions that we get, right? 1 plane of motion with flexion and extension. So you'd have 2 total or independent movements that can happen. If you went to the shoulder, now you can get all 3 planes of motion and you have a total of 6. And this is where the human body becomes really kind of cool when we start thinking about it. So when we start thinking about the upper extremity, right? So we have 2 angular degrees of freedom, or 4 independent movements that can occur. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? Now, if you start to think about your ankle, what can we do with our ankle? We can bring our toes to our shin. We can point our toes to the ground. So that's 1 and 2. Right? We can move our feet, or the bottom surface of our foot. We can have it come in and we can have it go out. Right? From a single plane idea. So you have 4 as well. When you get to your elbow, right? The elbow, like we said, is just 1. You have flexion and extension. Well, your knee has 1. It's flexion and extension, right? That angle either gets bigger or gets smaller. Can't move side to side. And it cannot spin. When we get to the shoulder, right, we have 1 angular degree of freedom to go up and down, forward and backwards, 1 to the side, right? And then we have 1 where we can rotate. So now all of a sudden we have 3 total degrees of freedom. We can move in all 3 planes, right? And 2 actions in each plane gives us 6 total. Well, the hip does the same thing, right? We can go forward and backwards, we can go side to side, and then we can rotate. So that becomes a really interesting part, is that the upper and lower extremities are essentially the same thing. So if you were to take your hand, right, and just turn it and put it on your desk, it all of a sudden looks like a leg. So your foot becomes your hand sitting on the desk. Your wrist is the ankle. We have our knee, your thigh, and then up into your hip. So they're the same thing, just they're just turned opposite directions from a movement standpoint, and the degrees of freedom and which actions are happening at which joint. So hopefully that's a good little introduction to what we got going on. And like I said, if you have any questions, please reach out, let me know, and we will go from there.